In this series, we're going to illustrate some examples of king and pawn versus king endgames, and we're going to see how the side that has the pawn can win the game. Okay, this is the simplest possible example, and this illustrates the concept of the square of the pawn. Here we see that white's king is extremely far away from the action, but white wants to promote its pawn to a queen by marching all the way down the A file until the queening square. So the problem here is that since white's king is so far away from its pawn, white's king cannot really get there in time to back up the pawn and help it promote. And so here in this example, white wants to rely on the pawn being able to get there in time unassisted by the monarch. And so the question here is, can it do so or not? So the way to determine if white's pawn can march in and queen unassisted is to count the square around the pawn and see if the opposing side can get into that square on the move, meaning as soon as white's pawn starts the march, if black's king can get into that square on that move, then white's pawn will not be able to get there on time. So that's called the square of the pawn. If black's king gets into the square of the pawn, white's pawn will be captured. Now, so what do I mean by the square of the pawn? Okay, here it's white's turn right now, and so white will go to A4. So now white will start chasing the pawn, and so white will move to F7. Now, as you can see, black's king is not inside the square of the pawn, because the square of the pawn right now is A4 to E4 to E8, and white's king is not on the E file. So if white's king is not on the E file on the move, and obviously it has to be on the E file and it has to be E4. Okay, if it were to be on E3, for example, that's not good enough. So it must be on the E file, E4 to E8, or even closer. So in this particular case, black's king is not going to get there in time, thanks to, of course, the jump that white's pawn has just made from A2 to A4. If not for that, then basically it would be a drawn game. But let's just see how it plays out. White continues to march down to its queening square. Black continues to chase. And as you can see, black does not get there in time, so white wins. Now, you might ask yourself, why doesn't... Let's go back to the beginning position. So you might ask yourself, why doesn't white just try to bring his king closer to the pawn and then assist in the advancement of the pawn? But the answer is that, unfortunately, if white tries to do that, it's not going to work. That's because in this particular case, this is a rook pawn. A rook pawn is very, very difficult to promote in this particular case. White doesn't even have to do anything. As a matter of fact, if white were to try to go that route, all black needs to do is make it to the C8 square. Okay, if black makes it to the C8 square, then white will never be able to promote, because as soon as the pawn gets to because black will basically go to B8, A8. Once black is in A8, it can't be kicked out of that corner. And even if black cannot make it to A8 because the white's king is in A8 or in A7, that will just block the pawn from promoting. So white's king will have to get out of the A file, and once white's king gets out of the A file, black's king will either walk into the A file or even the B file, or will just go and capture the pawn. So basically, it's really a race here. It's a race to the finish line, and white cannot rely on its monarch supporting the pawn here. The pawn needs to get there quickly before black's king can chase it down.